deregulation that facilitated the subprime mortgage crisis is the exact same deregulation that is now in place within the oil industry. The turning point for the oil industry is the year 2000. And a lot of things happened in the year 2000. Bush was appointed president. The 1999 merger of Exxon and Mobil went through. And in 2000, crude oil futures were deregulated. Focusing on the corporations and the oil corporations was always something that has been part of my work and part of the work that I've been a part of in organizing against the war in Iraq and trying to understand the Bush administration. In doing that, I have realized how much hesitancy there still is to, one, take on corporations. What does it mean to take on a corporation? How do you take on a corporation? Why should you take on corporations? But also just the almost black hole of information that we have on most companies, and in particular this industry. And why at this critical time when so many people, even Governor Palin among them, understand that climate change is a real phenomena and a critical phenomena, and that most people actually, particularly around the world and increasingly in the United States, believe that we are and have been fighting wars for oil, when we are facing a climate crisis and a military crisis, wars, all based in the same issue. Is this industry winning? Why in the midst of all this do they finally, after 30 years, get the moratorium on offshore drilling dropped? Why did they get their candidates into office? Why are they winning at the exact moment when actually you would think we would be winning? The last truly critical book on the oil industry that was written in 1975. It was called The Seven Sisters by Anthony Sampson. And if you haven't read it, read it, because it's shockingly relevant to the current moment that we're in. The other book that's been written is The Prize, really a Bible on the industry and very important to read, but not critical. So I set out to fill that void. And I learned a lot of interesting things along the way. One of the most important things I learned, which answers probably the number one answer to all of the questions that I laid out, for why we don't know very much about the industry, why it's winning, why we're fighting wars, why climate change is moving aggressively forward, is that big oil, and by big oil I mean a certain set of companies, and those are the largest oil companies operating in the United States. And those are ExxonMobil, Chevron, ConocoPhillips, BP, Shell, Marathon, and Valero. They are the most profitable industry in the history of the world. This industry has no comparison. And the one company, ExxonMobil, in 2003, ExxonMobil made the highest profits of any corporation in world history ever, period, adjusted for inflation, the highest profits ever. It topped it in 2004, topped it in 2005, topped it in 2006, 2007, 2008, just whoosh. But that's just one of the companies. Now, this is a fairly unfathomable amount of money, not just in comparison to other industries, but in comparison to us, right? So in comparison to those groups that are trying to advocate on behalf of the environment, against wars, for human rights, for science that demonstrates concretely that global warming is in fact a phenomenon. Antitrust. What are other good things that people do? I don't know, democracy. We cannot remotely compare, right, in terms of money. Now, this is, of course, part of a phenomena in which the United States is increasingly seeing income, of course, inequality grow, a shrinking pool of corporations and very, very rich people gaining a greater share of the income pie. So wealth is concentrating already in a small pocket of people, and then it's concentrating even more. So this group here exercises enormous influence. One of the things that I started off looking at was the history of the oil industry to see how did we get where we are. not just to map how the trajectory unfolded, but to say, how have we dealt with these experiences in the past, if we have? So the parent corporation of all of these companies is Standard Oil. And Standard Oil was the largest, most powerful corporation in the world. It had more money, it had more influence, it controlled oil. Standard Oil was the model on which basically the entire country, businesses across the country, modeled themselves and formed themselves into massive trusts, gobbled up other companies, built up power, and used that wealth and influence, following Standard's lead, to really control the US government. And in response, there was a mass people's movement in the United States around 1860, 1870, 1880, 1890, building up into at the turn of the century. People protested, they organized, they came together, they shut down cities, they shut down corporations, they demanded fundamental change. And one of the changes that they succeeded in getting were antitrust laws, called antitrust to break up the trusts, with Standard Oil being the focus, to put laws in place that would say corporations should not be allowed to get to a size where they are too big for the government to manage them, to regulate them, and to operate in the people's interest over corporate interests. And one of the tools that was developed was antitrust law to break up the companies. And the first big successful breakup was the breakup of Standard Oil from the largest corporation in the world into a company broken up into 34 pieces. That was the result in 1911 of a very successful, very organized people's movement. The movement didn't continue, didn't keep organizing, didn't keep focused, and essentially the government allowed the pieces of Standard Oil to slowly recongeal. The real attack, however, on antitrust law came during the 80s, when the Reagan administration essentially eviscerated the entire concept of antitrust. That was then carried through the Clinton administration into both Bush administrations. And what the evisceration of antitrust law did was allow it so that we had, beginning in the 1990s, but I'm going to start with a few earlier mergers, 2,600 mergers in the oil industry alone since 1991, including Chevron purchased Gulf, which then purchased Texaco, which then purchased Unocal to create the one company Chevron. Exxon and Mobil, the two largest post-Standard Oil pieces, allowed to rejoin, the two largest oil companies in the world allowed to merge and form one giant company. Conoco and Phillips. BP purchased Amoco, purchased Arco. Shell purchased smaller pieces, so that we allowed these enormous companies to come together to form these mega companies. And then we allowed these companies to buy up all of the independent refineries that had been functioning in the United States, independent gas stations that had been operating in the United States, such that we saw a mass reconsolidation of control into the hands of a very small number of corporations. These companies have used that consolidation to do things like, for example, in 1976, activists organized and passed the Clean Air Act. And one of the things the Clean Air Act tried to do was get refineries, which are massively polluting, to be cleaner. And the focus at the time was on acid rain, to get the refineries to operate more cleanly. The Clean Air Act said any new refinery built in the United States has to use the cleanest, most advanced technology so that we will have clean refineries. But there was a loophole, a big catch. All the existing refineries were grandfathered in. So that means everyone who lived near a refinery, your refinery stayed the same. Not a single new refinery has been built since 1976. And all of the companies are using the same old, decrepit refineries that they were using before. But because of consolidation, we've simply gotten rid of a number of refineries, and a smaller number of companies are operating the existing refineries. And they are choosing essentially to fight, the way the law was written, if they increase production to a certain amount at their refinery, they have to they have to retool the refineries to make them clean. And they've essentially fought for 30 years every time they do anything to their refineries to keep from retooling them, such that we have explosions at refineries constantly from 30-year-old pipes that are exploding. We have essentially old, decrepit, malfunctioning refineries. And it was expected that this essentially wouldn't take very long for all the refineries to get rebuilt. One of the reasons why the process was stalled and continues to remain stalled is that we have this shrinking number of companies that are owning the refineries. They are shrinking the number of refineries they have so that they can control how much oil gets refined into gasoline. They have bought up the gas stations so that they can control how much gasoline is sold. And through this chain of events, allowing the mergers, allowing the consolidation of the refineries, allowing the consolidation of the gas stations, we've allowed these companies to become enormous and powerful. When the companies owned all of the world's oil, they controlled the price. One of the things that happened was massive rebellions against the private companies controlling the entire fate of nations, the entire fate of the world by owning their oil. Independence movements all around the world, Iran, Iraq, Nigeria, Venezuela, countries all around the world kicking out the oil companies, taking control of their oil, forming into an organization of their own, the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, OPEC, to control the price of oil. Two big successes of the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries were the two 1970s oil crises where OPEC exercised its control over the price of oil. In response, the United States, including the oil companies and the US government, set out to break OPEC. And it did so. And it did so through three mechanisms. One was, believe it or not, conservation. The other was drilling for oil outside of the OPEC countries. The third was allowing crude oil to be traded on futures exchanges. The crude oil got introduced on the futures exchanges, but in 2000, the critical thing happened, which was deregulation of those exchanges, which meant that crude oil could suddenly be traded without any government oversight, without any government regulation. And the oil companies came together with the banks to form their own exchange, the Intercontinental Exchange, where they trade oil futures completely outside of government oversight or regulation. And if you want to know what happens when energy is traded completely outside of government regulation, you need only look at one company, Enron. Enron's energy traders and the loophole they created called the Enron loophole is the same loophole that's being used for crude oil. And Enron's energy traders move from electricity into the oil sector. And they're working at the banks, they're working at the oil companies, they're working in the hedge funds. And they are moving the price of oil up. So ever since that deregulation, the price of oil has been on a skyrocketing trajectory. The only comparison is the two periods in the 1970s when OPEC was intentionally manipulating price. We now have energy traders intentionally manipulating price to drive the price up. The reason for the recent massive volatility in the price of oil is individual traders. And this type of volatility is endemic of an unregulated exchange. Banks in the United States, are the ones that have survived, are essentially morphing into oil companies themselves. They're buying up oil fields, they're buying up pipelines, they are trading in commercial quantities of oil so that they are allowed to trade as commercial traders so that they can take advantage of deregulation in the crude futures markets. So this is a good thing for us to keep our eyes on, as particularly as the banks are collapsing over here because of the subprime mortgage crisis, right? They're moving into the oil industry. And of course, now we will have the two largest financial behemoths concentrating in one area, oil, making it all the more important that we address the deregulation and keep an eye on what they're doing. So the price of oil is going up and up and up and up. The deregulation is moving forward. Add to that a Bush administration that in 2000, remember the year 2000, received more money. The oil industry spent more money getting Bush and Cheney into office than they have spent on any election ever. What they got when they put Bush and Cheney in was a whole team of people who had worked for the oil industry, who could essentially stop lobbying and start legislating within the government. And that's what they've done. They have deregulated further. They have opened up new areas for oil drilling. They have reduced taxation. They have increased subsidies. They have coddled the industry, enabled it to merge, enabled it to dominate. They have gone to war for the industry. They have fought to try and gain greater access. The Bush administration is not only fighting in Iraq. The Bush administration is also, of course, threatening Iran. The Bush administration is also engaged in military action against Pakistan. But the Bush administration has also expanded U.S. military bases, the U.S. military footprint, greater than at any time since the beginning of the Cold War. John McCain is very straightforward about this, right? If you saw in the debates when he was talking about Georgia and talking about the region. He said, this is about oil. He said, we're fighting about oil. And yay. You know, we need to. He's very straightforward. That his policies are a need to secure oil. The drill, baby, drill mantra is just very, very simply, of course, feeding on a defense that is used all across the country to beat back incredibly important environmental laws, environmental justice laws, human rights laws around the world, which is that the price of oil will increase unless you let us do these things. And drill, baby, drill is if we open up offshore, if we open up the Midwest, if we drill in the tar sands, if we open up the United States and North America to drilling, we'll have energy security, which is an admission, of course, right, that we're fighting wars for oil. And if we are fighting wars for oil, we're losing them, and it's time to come home. If for no other reason, it's time to come home immediately. We can talk more about all the fallacies around drill, baby, drill, but and many of them are talked about, but the one I would like to emphasize is that we have been drilling. In the United States, our stocks of oil, the amount of oil that's just sitting in storage facilities around the country, are higher, and were particularly the highest when the price of gasoline was the highest. The oil companies are sitting on the stocks because oil is worth more tomorrow than it's worth today. And they're choosing not to refine it into gasoline to keep the price of gasoline higher. So if you actually want to lower gas prices, which I don't think we should, but if you want to, it's concentration in the oil industry that is the problem. It's big oil that is the problem, not that we're not drilling sufficiently, not to mention all of the many costs associated with drilling. Now, that is not to say that we will not, at some point in the very near future, in the world and in the United States, reach the point where demand will exceed supply. But we are not there yet. We are not there now. That's not the reason why the price is rising. They are moving aggressively into far more environmentally damaging methods of production. So one of the messages that I hope people will take from the book is that big oil clearly intends to remain big oil and to do everything it can to do that. There are 3 countries where the oil is left: Saudi Arabia, Iran, and Iraq. getting into and controlling through whatever mechanisms those countries. That's the conventional oil. Getting into the oil that's left in Africa, getting into the oil that's left in other regions in the world. Getting the oil from the folks who already have it, but then going into the new areas to get the new oil. So the tar sands of Canada, the shale regions of the Midwest, offshore. There's a lot of reasons why that production is bad, and we can talk about that. But just really quickly on offshore drilling, because Governor Palin likes to talk about clean offshore drilling, and she repeats that phrase constantly. There's many, many reasons why that's a problem. But one very simple reason is that drilling offshore takes place, offshore, in the areas where storms happen, and the storms come passing through and they knock the drilling rigs off their platforms and they go floating 80 miles down from where they were, and when they break off, the pipelines connecting them break off and the oil spills into the ocean. And that's just when there's accidents. But beyond that, drilling at water depths of greater than 500 feet, which is where most of the drilling is taking place, and now it's moving into 1,000 feet, 5,000 feet, this is where most of the offshore drilling is taking place, releases methane. Methane is 20 times more climate changing causing than CO2, 20 times more. This is one of the worst ideas. If you are Sarah Palin and you believe that climate change is happening, and she talks about the effects in Alaska, you cannot simultaneously advocate a mode of production that is 20 times more climate causing and call it clean at the same time. In addition, it is incredibly expensive. They use diamond encrusted drill bits to drill offshore. It costs $120 million for every single hole. 80% of the holes are dry. Why do they do it? And we also know that it'll take 10 years for the oil to come out, right? Why do they do it? One, when oil is selling at $90 a barrel, $150 a barrel, it'll be $500 a barrel. Even that 20% is worth it. Also, they want to what's called book the reserves. They want to gain access to all the oil everywhere so they can show that it's theirs, so that they can show that their reserves are big. That's why they want to own and control the fields in Iraq. That's why they want to own and control the fields in Iran. Not just sell the oil, own the oil. If they can book it, that's how their stocks get bigger. It's how they show that they're a bigger, more profitable company. That's why they are so hell-bent on going everywhere, anywhere to get the oil, and to get elected officials in who will follow them down that path. There's at least two mechanisms that I propose. One is the old traditional method, break them up, make them so that they can be controllable. They are too big. We have laws, we have built mechanisms already in place that simply say corporations should not be bigger than the government, should not be bigger than our ability to organize as communities against them. Break them up, simple. Another mechanism is a policy put forward by a group that I work with, Oil Change International, that calls for the separation of oil and state. Based on very successful campaigns in the 1990s against the tobacco industry, that made tobacco money toxic, essentially, to candidates. It became so negative to be associated with the tobacco industry that candidates moved away from the tobacco industry, that policies were able to be implemented that were very regulatory of an industry that people thought in the 90s was impenetrable. And to do the same with oil. And to say, candidates have to renounce all oil industry money, and we will vote for the least oily candidate among the candidates, as a way to demonstrate that campaign promises actually become reality. And then all the host of amazing strategies that we all know are critically important, most importantly, particularly here in the United States, reducing consumption. But we need our candidates to proclaim their commitment to investments in things that make it possible for us to transition from oil, most importantly, public transportation. And we need to tax the industry, and we need to regulate the industry, and we need to constrain its activities so that when we have our movements for the critically important things like stopping wars, we are not going against these behemoths.
Our freedoms and our rights are slowly being eroded by executive orders and by signing statements.
Do you think the government should be able to just march in for a developer and kick you out? You should think that if it can happen here, it can happen to anyone, anywhere.
This devolution of the American press began in 1988 when Ronald Reagan abolished the Fairness Doctrine.
I don't understand why we can't have a little piece of history when everybody else has so much.
No more stolen, fraudulent elections.
This is Freddy's Brooklyn Roundhouse with Cynthia McKinney.
As my fellow Brooklynite, Allen Ginsberg said, the soul should never die ungodly in an armed madhouse.
Freddy's Brooklyn Roundhouse. Watch the show the corporate media doesn't want you to see. Tuesdays at 8 in Brooklyn, Thursdays at 8:30 in Manhattan, and online all the time at Freddy'sBrooklynRoundhouse.org and YouTube.com/Atlantic Yards.